Hollywood is a place built on illusion. Lights, cameras, perfect faces, but behind all that glamour lies a world carefully crafted to keep up appearances. Beneath the flawless hairlines and glamorous curls, some of the biggest stars in film history were hiding something in plain sight: wigs. Not just on set, not just for roles, but in their daily lives, on red carpets, in interviews, and even behind closed doors. While millions admired their beauty, confidence, and screen presence, few realized they were looking at carefully styled secrets. Wigs in Hollywood weren't just costume pieces, they were armor. For some, they hid hair loss. For others, they helped reshape an image or hold on to youth in an industry that wasn't kind to aging. And for a few, wigs became part of a lifelong transformation, concealing parts of their past they never wanted the world to see. From old Hollywood legends to icons of the 1980s, some of the most unforgettable faces on screen were never quite what they seemed. They smiled for cameras, accepted awards, became household names, all while quietly wearing a disguise no one was supposed to notice. In this video, we're revealing 14 stars who kept this secret tucked under perfectly placed hair. Some names will surprise you. Some you might have always wondered about. But all of them shared one thing: a hidden truth, worn just above the eyebrows. Stick around, the illusion is about to lift. Sean Connery, the hair beneath the tuxedo. He was the ultimate gentleman spy. Sharp suit, steely stare, and that unmistakable voice that made everything sound like a secret. Sean Connery wasn't just the first James Bond. To many, he was Bond. But even 007 had something to hide. What most fans didn't know was that by the time Connery first slipped into Bond's iconic tuxedo in Dr. No, 1962, he was already balding. At just 32, Connery had begun wearing a toupee, not as part of the character, but as a permanent part of his public identity. In a business built on image, Connery's hair became one of his most tightly guarded secrets. He wore custom-fitted hairpieces throughout his Bond years and beyond, fooling millions with a look that suggested effortless strength and timeless style. Directors, costumers, and makeup artists became silent collaborators in the illusion, maintaining the sleek, confident silhouette fans had come to expect. But what made Connery unique was that his charm never truly came from his hair. Long after he left the Bond franchise, and even as he embraced his natural look in later films like The Untouchables, his presence only seemed to grow stronger. The toupee may have built the legend, but it was Connery's quiet confidence and magnetic force that made him unforgettable. His hair was a prop. His talent was the truth. And yet, for decades, very few ever noticed. That was the magic of Sean Connery, the man who wore secrets as seamlessly as he wore a tuxedo. Rita Hayworth, the face that wasn't born that way. To the world, she was the ultimate screen siren, the fiery-haired goddess who could silence a room with a glance. When Rita Hayworth danced across the screen in Gilda, she didn't just perform, she hypnotized. But beneath the iconic red waves and sculpted Hollywood glamour was a woman who had undergone a quiet transformation so complete, even she once said, "Men go to bed with Gilda, but wake up with me." Rita Hayworth was not born a redhead, nor was she born with the smooth, glowing skin and symmetrical features that Hollywood celebrated. She was born Margarita Carmen Cancino, with dark, coarse hair, a widowed hairline, and an identity shaped by heritage. But in the studio system of the 1940s, that wasn't the image they wanted. So they changed her. Her hair was bleached, her hairline raised through painful electrolysis, and wigs became a constant tool in maintaining the illusion. The lush red mane that became her trademark was often not her own, but a carefully crafted wig, styled to perfection and fitted like a crown. It became a symbol, not just of beauty, but of reinvention. And it worked. America didn't just love Rita Hayworth, it worshipped her. But the transformation came at a cost. Beneath the beauty was a woman always half in hiding, between who she had to be and who she once was. The wigs, the hairline, the name, all part of a lifelong performance that extended far beyond the screen. Rita Hayworth wasn't just playing roles. She was the role, and her most famous costume was the hair that helped her disappear. Lucille Ball, the red that was never hers. She was the queen of comedy, the first lady of television, and a pioneer who changed entertainment forever. But before the laughter, before the camera ever rolled on I Love Lucy, Lucille Ball was already living in disguise. The fiery red hair, as famous as her laugh, was never natural. And often it wasn't even real. Lucille Ball was born a quiet brunette from Jamestown, New York. When she arrived in Hollywood in the 1930s, she struggled to stand out. Studio executives liked her look, but they didn't love it. That changed when she went red. Bright, bold, and unforgettable, her new hair color became her trademark. But there was a cost to keeping that flame alive. Red dye in those days wasn't gentle. It was harsh, toxic, and unforgiving. To protect her scalp from constant processing, Lucille wore wigs, dozens of them. On set, in public appearances, even during rehearsals, she often covered her natural hair with a custom piece, carefully styled into her signature look. Her iconic poofy curls were sculpted not with curlers, but with craftsmanship. Behind the scenes, she was meticulous. Each wig had its own number, its own routine, its own place in a tightly controlled visual world. What the audience saw was spontaneous chaos, zany expressions, pratfalls, and physical comedy. But underneath was discipline, structure, and the armor of a woman who knew the price of being unforgettable. Lucille Ball made the world laugh until it cried. But the red hair? That was part of the act, a symbol not just of style, but survival. She didn't just dye her hair. She dyed her destiny and wore it like crown. Clark Gable, the king's crown was fitted. To millions, he was simply the king. With that chiseled jaw, knowing grin, and effortless charm, Clark Gable ruled the silver screen. He didn't need to chase the spotlight, it followed him. Whether standing tall and gone with the wind or commanding attention in every frame he appeared in, Gable carried the air of a man in total control. But there was one thing even the king of Hollywood couldn't control: time. By the 1950s, Gable's once thick hair had begun to thin. For a star whose image relied so much on classic masculinity, losing hair in an era obsessed with youth wasn't just inconvenient, it was unthinkable. The solution? A carefully tailored hairpiece, designed not for flamboyance, but invisibility. Unlike some of his peers, Gable didn't go dramatic. His wig was subtle, nearly invisible to the public eye, even under the bright glare of studio lights. It was meticulously styled to match the relaxed, swept-back look that fans had come to associate with his devil-may-care charm. Only his closest confidants knew when he was wearing it and when he wasn't. What makes Gable's story so compelling isn't just the wig, it's how seamlessly he wore it. He didn't let it define him. He used it to preserve a legend the world wasn't ready to let go of. Even as age crept in, Gable played every role with the same quiet strength, the same cool defiance that made him iconic. His crown may have been made of hair and glue, but his legacy? That was real. And like any true king, he never let them see the cracks beneath the crown. Elizabeth Taylor, the Velvet Illusion. Elizabeth Taylor didn't walk into rooms, she entered them. Regal, unshakable. With eyes the color of violets and a face sculpted for cinema, she wasn't just admired, she was mythologized. Few stars in Hollywood history have burned as brightly or for as long. But behind the iconic jewels, the lavish gowns, and the unforgettable gaze was a woman who understood that image wasn't just a reflection, it was a fortress. And at the center of that fortress, her hair. Taylor's dark, voluminous curls became part of her cinematic signature, from Cleopatra's commanding braids to her soft waves in Cat on a hot tin roof. But few knew how often those lush locks were synthetic. Throughout her life, Elizabeth used wigs not just on screen, but off. As early as her 30s, she began relying on them to manage health issues, protect her real hair from overstyling, and preserve the consistency of her brand, her image. To the world, she was timeless. Untouchable. But time never stops, not even for legends. Wigs allowed her to remain untouched by the mundane concerns of aging and damage. They became her quiet allies, pieces that matched the diamond-dripping elegance of her public life. When she faced health challenges later on, including hospitalizations and physical strain, her wigs didn't just maintain her look, they protected her mystique. Elizabeth Taylor was never just playing roles. She was curating a presence, majestic, controlled, and larger than life. Every public appearance was a performance, and every performance deserved perfection. The truth? Sometimes the crown wasn't made of gold or emeralds, it was styled, pinned, and worn like a secret. Because when you're already a legend, reality becomes optional. Humphrey Bogart, the tough guy with a tender secret. He had the voice of gravel and a stare that could cut glass. Humphrey Bogart didn't need to raise his voice to command a scene. He just needed to light a cigarette, narrow his eyes, and say one line like he meant it. In Casablanca, The Maltese Falcon, and dozens of other classics, he became the blueprint for the American tough guy. But while he played men with nothing to hide, Bogart himself was hiding something right on top of his head. By the time Bogart became a leading man, his hair was thinning fast. In a time when screen idols were expected to be impossibly polished, even a receding hairline could mean fewer roles. So, without a word, the studios took action. A discreet toupee was made, not overly full, not flashy, just enough to keep the illusion intact. Unlike actors who dramatically reinvented their look, Bogart's hairpiece was designed to go unnoticed. It was part of his uniform, the trench coat, the fedora, the ever-present cigarette, and the carefully styled hair that didn't quite belong to him. Few fans suspected a thing. That's how subtle the illusion was, and how good he was at embodying it. But there's something beautifully ironic about Bogart's secret. The man who played so many emotionally guarded loners, who seemed like he never had anything to prove, was quietly doing what countless stars did behind closed doors, protecting an image the public expected to see. For Bogart, the hair wasn't vanity. It was armor. A quiet act of self-preservation in an industry that gave no second chances. He never broke character, not even for the mirror. Yul Brynner, the bald lie. He was unmistakable, the polished dome, the intense gaze, the voice that sounded like it had been carved in stone. Yul Brynner didn't just play kings, he was one. Whether ruling in The King and I or commanding in the Ten Commandments, he made baldness iconic long before it was cool. To the world, he seemed completely unbothered by vanity. After all, what kind of man chooses to go bald in Hollywood? But the truth is, Yul Brynner didn't always choose it. In fact, the bald head that became his signature started as a temporary decision, one he made for the original stage production of The King and I. He shaved his head for the role and liked the way it set him apart. It gave him an edge, a silhouette no one else had. But what few knew was that before he became the bald legend, he was just another actor with thick black hair and a wig or two tucked away backstage. In his early career, before the dome became a brand, Brynner wore wigs for stage roles and screen tests, carefully styled to fit whatever look casting directors wanted. Even after becoming famous for his bald head, he wasn't above throwing on a hairpiece if a role demanded it. He could become anyone, a prince, a pharaoh, a warrior, and if that transformation required hair, so be it. The irony? He became the most famous bald man in Hollywood history, but only after he stopped pretending. Yul Brynner didn't lose his hair, he gave it up. On purpose. And that choice, it rewrote the rules of screen presence, because sometimes the boldest statement is having nothing to hide. Joan Crawford, perfect hair, perfect control. Joan Crawford never allowed herself to be seen undone. Her power wasn't just in her acting, it was in her presentation. Every eyebrow arched to precision, every dress sharply fitted, every line delivered with ice. She was a woman who demanded control over every frame, every photograph, every inch of her image. And her hair? It was never just hair, it was a symbol. Sculpted, unyielding, iconic. As she moved into the later stages of her career, the illusion became harder to maintain. Time, stress, and decades of harsh styling took their toll. But Crawford didn't give in. Instead, she turned to one of Hollywood's oldest secrets, wigs. Not just for roles, but for life. Her wigs were high-end, handmade human hair, expertly colored and styled to match the sharp silhouette of the Crawford look. Whether she was on a film set or attending a charity gala, her hair never looked out of place. That wasn't an accident. It was obsession. Assistants knew not to touch it. Hairdressers followed strict instructions. In some cases, she had backup wigs styled identically in case anything went wrong. The wigs weren't vanity. They were armor. Crawford didn't fear imperfection. She simply refused to let anyone else see it. In an industry where actresses were discarded as they aged, she chose to fight back, strand by strand. Behind the steel stare and power suits was a woman who knew her currency was image. And she spent it wisely. Her wigs weren't just about beauty, they were about survival. Joan Crawford didn't age out of Hollywood. She forced it to keep looking her way. And what you saw was always exactly what she wanted you to. Rock Hudson, the matinee idol's mirage. He had the kind of face that seemed sculpted by the silver screen itself, broad shoulders, square jaw, and a smile that could light up a theater. Rock Hudson wasn't just a leading man, he was the leading man of his generation. On screen, he was effortless, the perfect romantic hero, the clean-cut gentleman, the all-American heartthrob. But Hollywood is a place where perfection is rarely real. And for Rock Hudson, one part of his classic image had to be manufactured, then maintained. From his early years in Hollywood, Hudson struggled with thinning hair, a quiet reality masked beneath layers of studio polish. By the time he was starring in blockbusters and pairing up with Doris Day, his hairline was already receding. But the public never knew, because they never saw it. Not once. Hudson wore a toupee through most of his peak career, often custom-fitted by studio stylists to match the exact color and density of his original hair. The pieces were seamless, they had to be. He was playing dream men ideals, fantasies wrapped in tuxedos and sincerity. There was no room for reality. Off-screen, he kept the illusion alive. Public appearances, magazine shoots, interviews, all carefully calculated to keep the image intact. He wasn't the only one doing it, but few did it with such quiet consistency. There were no slip-ups, no candid photos. The mask, or in this case, the hair, never cracked. Hudson's legacy is still one of elegance and old-school charm, but it's also a lesson in the architecture of fame. He wasn't hiding out of shame. He was protecting the role he'd been cast in, both by studios and by the world. Because sometimes, to play the perfect man, you need a little help on top. Bette Davis, eyes that could kill, hair that couldn't stay. She didn't need to move a muscle to steal a scene. Her eyes did all the work. Bette Davis was a force of nature, sharp as broken glass and twice as dangerous. She didn't beg for attention. She commanded. From All About Eve to Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, Davis carved out a place in Hollywood where few women were allowed to stand, unapologetically powerful. But behind those defiant stares and fearless performances, she was fighting a quiet, constant battle. One not in the script, but in the mirror. Bette Davis lost much of her natural hair early in her career, and not just to time. The harsh chemicals, overstyling, and transformations demanded by studios left her with weak, thinning hair. She wasn't alone. It was an unspoken price of fame in the golden age, but Davis was not the type to surrender. She didn't cover up the problem with shame. She covered it with strategy. Her wigs weren't just functional, they were dramatic, tailored to each performance like a costume. She wore them in nearly every role past a certain point, and often in her personal life as well. Some were glamorous, some grotesque, and some so subtle no one noticed. But they were always intentional. The right wig gave her control, not just of her appearance, but of her persona. For Davis, the hair wasn't about youth or vanity. It was about preparation, precision, power. If the role demanded vulnerability, she showed it, but never without control. Her image, like her talent, was too sharp to leave to chance. She didn't wear wigs to hide. She wore them to own the room before she even walked in. Cary Grant, elegance engineered. Cary Grant was the embodiment of effortless charm. Suave, unbothered, impeccably dressed. He didn't just walk into scenes, he glided. No one made it look easier. But that was the trick. Cary Grant's entire career was built on making the impossible look natural. Every line delivered just right, every gesture precise. He was grace in motion. And like any master illusionist, his secret was in the details, including the one sitting quietly atop his head. As he moved into his later career, Grant began relying on subtle hairpieces to maintain his clean, debonair image. Never theatrical, never obvious. His toupees were masterpieces of understatement, crafted not to transform, but to preserve. They weren't there to make him someone else. They were there to help him stay Cary Grant a little longer. Unlike other actors whose hairpieces became noticeable with time, Grant's choices were discreet. He worked with expert stylists who created toupees so finely blended, audiences never suspected. The goal wasn't volume or vanity, it was continuity. His look had become iconic, and icons don't change with the seasons. What's most fascinating is how Grant handled all with the same elegance he brought to every role. No drama, no denial, no tabloid revelations. Just quiet professionalism. He understood that in Hollywood, illusion isn't deception. It's part of the craft. Cary Grant wasn't hiding behind a wig. He was refining the performance, every moment, every scene, down to the last strand. Because when you play perfection for a lifetime, every detail counts, even the ones no one is supposed to notice. Marlene Dietrich, hair by illusion, face by design. Marlene Dietrich didn't age, she evolved. With her smoky voice, sculpted cheekbones, and otherworldly poise, she wasn't just a movie star, she was a myth in motion. Every time she stepped into the frame, it felt like stepping into a dream. But behind the hypnotic stare and perfectly tailored gowns was an artist obsessed with control. Dietrich didn't rely on beauty, she engineered it. And at the heart of that illusion was a weapon more powerful than any costume, the wig. She treated wigs like architecture. They weren't accessories, they were part of a larger structure, designed to transform not just her appearance, but how light touched her face. With meticulous care, she selected wigs based on how they framed her features, how they caught a spotlight, how they shifted the mood of a single close-up. Sometimes platinum, sometimes ash blonde, sometimes styled to appear completely natural. They were all part of the same master plan. Behind the scenes, she was legendary for her precision. Her dressing rooms were filled with mirrors, lights angled just so. She'd often apply her own makeup and direct the styling of her wigs, down to the millimeter. There was no such thing as just hair to Marlene Dietrich. Every strand had a role to play in the illusion. Even off-screen, she rarely dropped the act. Public appearances were treated like performances, her wigs as seamless as her posture. She didn't just use them to maintain youth. She used them to shape identity, to own every inch of her reflection. Marlene Dietrich didn't chase beauty trends. She built them, strand by strand, spotlight by spotlight, illusion by illusion. Angela Lansbury, the hair behind the mystery. Angela Lansbury never shouted for attention, she simply earned it. Whether playing the doting sleuth Jessica Fletcher, a sinister mother in The Manchurian Candidate, or a warm teapot in Beauty and the Beast, she carried herself with quiet authority. She wasn't built on glamour, but on presence. And perhaps that's why few ever questioned what was hidden just above her thoughtful gaze. The hair was rarely her own. Throughout her long career, particularly during her television reign in Murder, she wrote, Lansbury wore wigs almost exclusively. But they weren't flashy or dramatic. Quite the opposite. Her wigs were designed to disappear, to blend so completely into the fabric of her character that no one thought twice. And that was exactly the point. Unlike the high-glam stars of earlier decades, Lansbury's wig use was about continuity and control, not spectacle. Playing a character every week for over a decade meant keeping a consistent look, one that could survive countless episodes, long shooting hours, and changing real-life conditions. The wigs provided that stability. They allowed her to focus on performance, not maintenance. Behind the scenes, she was deeply involved in process. The color, the style, the cut, all carefully chosen to reflect Jessica Fletcher's personality, practical, intelligent, and never too polished. There was no vanity in the decision, only discipline. Angela Lansbury didn't use wigs to become larger than life. She used them to ground her characters, to make them real, familiar, and enduring. Because when the mystery is unfolding and every detail matters, even the hair has to play its part, perfectly, quietly, invisibly. Burt Reynolds, the hair that rode shotgun. Burt Reynolds was the man's man of the 70s, fast cars, sly smirks, and a mustache that practically had its own career. He was charm and swagger personified, a star who looked like he belonged behind the wheel of a Trans AM with nothing in the rearview mirror but dust and trouble. But even the coolest guy in the room had a secret riding shotgun. And in Burt's case, it was sitting quietly right on top of his head. Reynolds began experiencing hair loss early in his career, long before he became a household name. By the time he was breaking box office records, he had already turned to hairpieces to maintain the rugged, youthful look fans had come to expect. His toupees were part of the image, but like everything with Burt, they were handled with a wink and a shrug. He never made a public fuss about it, but he didn't deny it either. It was part of the show, and he knew it. Unlike many of his peers who wore wigs to hide, Reynolds seemed to wear his with a kind of unspoken understanding. You want Burt Reynolds? This is part of the deal. His toupees were so well-crafted and consistent, they became inseparable from the image. Whether running from cops, starring in a Western, or hosting a late-night show, the hair was always just right, windswept, full, and defiant. But underneath the hairpiece was a performer who knew the game. The look mattered. The brand mattered. And if a little extra hair kept the illusion intact, so be it. Because for Burt Reynolds, the hair didn't make the man, but it sure helped him look like one hell of a ride. Hollywood has always been a place where illusion meets reality, where the smallest detail, even strand of hair, can shape how we see our icons. What these 14 stars remind us is that even the most legendary faces were not immune to the pressure of perfection. They wore wigs not out of vanity, but out of necessity to preserve a role, an image, or a sense of control in an industry that rarely offers second chances. But their talent, that was never fake. The hair might have been synthetic, but the impact they left was real. Each of these actors and actresses built legacies that reached far beyond their appearance. They gave us unforgettable performances, timeless characters, and moments that still live on decades later. And in doing so, they prove that authenticity isn't always about what's visible. Sometimes it's about what's endured. Wigs, hairpieces, illusions, all part of the performance. But what made them legends was never what they covered up. It was what they revealed through their craft. If you enjoyed this journey into the quiet side of Hollywood history, let us know. Drop a comment below. Tell us which one surprised you the most, or if you knew all along. And if you'd like more untold stories from the golden age of film and beyond, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you never miss a moment. Because sometimes the real stories are the ones just beneath the surface.